Hi, my name is Mike Steinell, and welcome to the Poetics of Jazz Improvisation. This is a video version of a presentation that I gave at the Jazz Education Network Conference in Atlanta, Georgia on January 10th, 2025. If you're watching on YouTube, please realize I've had to remove some of the musical examples for licensing reasons. There'll be a prompt at that point in the video, and you can go below and find the link in the description and listen to the example. I welcome comments and questions, and you can do so by emailing me at mike@mikesteinell.com. So enjoy. I hope you find it helpful. This is the Poetics of Jazz Improvisation. Thanks for being here. The title of this clinic and its contents was inspired by a lecture which Lyle Mayes gave at the University of North Texas on February 23, 1993. I am dedicating this presentation to his memory. I taught at UNT for 32 years. Lyle Mayes was without a doubt one of our most distinguished alums. Lyle was a student at UNT in the 1970s before embarking on a great career that included a stint with the Woody Herman Orchestra and a decades-long collaboration with Pat Metheny. At UNT, Lyle played in the 1 O'Clock Lab Band, and the Grammy-nominated album, Lab 75, featured his music exclusively. I, like many others, made my decision to attend North Texas State, as it was called then, after hearing what is commonly referred to as the Lizard album, Lab 75. If it wasn't for that album and the innovative compositions and arrangements of Lyle Mayes, I don't think I would have gone to North Texas, and I'm not sure I would be here today in this capacity. So thank you, Lyle Mayes. If you're unfamiliar with the music of Lyle Mayes, or perhaps you haven't heard Eberhard, his last composition recorded shortly before his death, and the winner of the Grammy for Best Instrumental Composition in 2022, pause this video and take a minute. You can use the link below in the description to listen to Eberhard. It's an amazing piece of music. It was my recollection that Lyle titled his lecture in 1993, The Poetics of Jazz. At the time, I assumed it was a reference to Igor Stravinsky's Poetics of Music, which in turn was a tip of the hat to Aristotle's Poetics. The term poetics may seem odd to some. We understand what a poem is and what poetry is, and we can recognize something as being poetic. But the term poetics actually comes from the verb poem, P-O-I-E-I-N, meaning to do or make. Poetics is a study of making. Stravinsky prefaces his lectures in 1939, stating that poetics is the study of certain and inevitable rules of craft. As I began preparing for this clinic, I realized I couldn't simply rely on my memory of a lecture over 30 years in the past. I enlisted the help of Maristella Fustel, a former student and an archivist at the University of North Texas Music Library. She found it, a grainy VHS copy with poor audio. The lecture was as remarkable as I had remembered. The topics covered included musical maturity, improviser as composer, flow, clarity, unity, motivic manipulation, variety, contrast and balance, imitation and inspiration, designing a music for the world at large, foundational preparation, finding your voice, and poetic transformation. As it turned out, I was wrong in remembering that he'd titled the lecture The Poetics of Jazz, but everything he spoke had to do with making, or as Stravinsky says, the certain and inevitable rules of craft. I began to prepare for this presentation in May. As I watched the video of the lecture, each new topic led me back to other sources, things I have read, starting with Stravinsky's Poetics, things I've heard in other presentations, and ideas I've worked out in 40 years of my own teaching. I became confused as to how to organize the information, where to start, how to sequence, what to emphasize, what to omit. I must admit it was all a jumble. Everything was so connected, but not in a linear way. It was clear to do it right, I would not only need to talk about Lyle's presentation, but amplify it with other resources and some of my own ideas. I enlisted the help of a great group of thinkers. Stravinsky, from his Poetics on Music, Dave Liebman, from his Self-Portrait of a Jazz Artist, Hal Crook, from How to Improvise, Bill Dobbins, from an article in 1980, Jerry Coker, from Improvising Jazz, Jim Riggs, from his Conversational Connections presentation, Paul Hindemith, from The Craft of Composition, and also Bird and Miles. The question of how to organize it loomed. It kept me up at night. I decided that I had to approach it like a detective, so I did what a detective would do. I made a crime board, like on TV. Here it is. It starts with Lyle Mayes, who is the head of the crime family, if you want to think of it that way. Then we got Stravinsky, Hindemith, Hal Crook, Dave Liebman, Bill Dobbins, Jerry Coker, and finally Jim Riggs. Everything was connected, but I was confused, so I did what I had to do. I got out the red yarn. I connected this to that, and that to this, and then that thing to another thing. Sometimes I had to back up and start over. The yarn seemed to go everywhere. But eventually I got there. The Poetics of Jazz Improvisation. I had a plan. I might have to change it, but I had a plan. I'm sorry, that was a bit silly, wasn't it? But I couldn't help myself. It's a crime board, after all. Before we go further, I want to talk about some disclaimers and warnings. Everything in this presentation is expressed through my personal lens, open to refuting and prone to contradiction. I welcome your comments and your criticism. Here's my email. So now here's the plan. Number 1, I want to present the ideas that mainly go beyond the nuts and bolts of improvisation, which will be tone, time, style, and vocabulary. I've done a lot of presentations on those in the past, and most of my teaching was involved with that. But this is something beyond that. So going beyond nuts and bolts will show us how to use those nuts and bolts to make something truly artistic. Number 2, this will not be just a discussion. I plan to offer particular suggestions on the application of these ideas. In some cases, these will be exercises. I will call these suggestions / exercises toolbox items, things to add to your toolbox. Watch for the red toolbox icon. Lyle covered many topics, but I want to point out 2 overarching themes: achieving musical maturity and going beyond the what to get to the why. To paraphrase Lyle, if we are only aware of the what, of a melody, harmony, or rhythm, and don't explore the why they are effective at times and not at others, it will be difficult to create music that demonstrates the qualities of musical maturity, clarity, unity, and flow. In terms that may be appropriate for this audience, I would say if we admire and wish to emulate a great musician, say Charlie Parker, but we only know what he played and don't consider why what he played works so well, our music will only be a pale imitation of Charlie Parker. Stravinsky alludes to the concept when he speaks of principles. Every formal process proceeds from principle, and the study of principles allows us to extricate ourselves from the tangle of endless possibilities and the indecision of vague thoughts. Can we linger on that for a minute? The tangle of endless possibilities and the indecision of vague thoughts. I think Lyle might agree and might suggest the way out is to first be aware of the what, then identify the principles from which they proceed, then dig down like an archaeologist to find the why. Musical maturity, understanding the why, requires that we go beyond nuts and bolts. But it doesn't mean that fundamentals aren't important. All advanced skill is built on a strong foundation. Dave Lieben, in his Chromatic Approach to Jazz Harmony, offers a list of foundational skills which should be mastered before moving to more advanced topics. It's a great list. He calls them jazz basics. They are mastery of scales, modes, chords, arpeggios in the diatonic language, ability to play chord changes fluidly, convincingly swing in a jazz sense, know the basic repertoire, understand voicings, awareness of historical recordings and artistic milestones, have an awareness of the customs and unwritten rules of group playing and soloing, and a general idea of the history of Western music. He uses an aphorism: one has to walk before running. In his lecture, Lyle reminds students that progress requires patience. He talked of the 12-year lag. He suggested that we're introduced to music early, age 4 or earlier, and we perform it in middle and high school. But for many, the study of how to make music or how to understand the making of music, that is, harmony, melody, rhythm, form, modulation, etc., begins in college, 12 years later. As I watched the video, I could sense Lyle's concern for the students, drawing from his own experience and frustrations, that they not get so fixated on nuts and bolts of improvising that they don't take time to think about the qualities that make music artistic. Lyle called these qualities features. Each is built on a principle. They are flow, motivic transformation, clarity, balance, unity, ambiguity, and a sense of adventure. After speaking of the 12-year lag, Lyle states that basically an improviser is a composer and must think like a composer. This is his opening premise. Obviously, there is general agreement about this. Stravinsky had it the other way to some degree. The composer is an improviser. From his Poetics of Music, page 55. A composer improvises aimlessly the way an animal grubs about, both of them because they yield to a compulsion to seek things out. Now, let us not be too hard on Igor Stravinsky. Contrary to the tone of that comment, he didn't think poorly of jazz improvisers. In an interview in the 1960s, perhaps on Edward R. Murrell's Person to Person, when asked what the most important musical development of the 20th century might be, he answered without hesitation, American jazz. Digging a little deeper, we turn to Bill Dobbins, Professor Emeritus at the Eastman School of Music. Bill, in his 1980 article in the MENC Journal titled Improvisation, an Essential Element of Musical Proficiency, states, "The improviser develops a different version of the given work in every single performance. Each version is simultaneously a finished work and a single stage of a work in progress." You know, when I read that, I felt a little better about what I do, that is, playing jazz. To illustrate this concept, I want us to observe a decade of Miles Davis playing the same song, My Funny Valentine. There are at least 5 recordings of him performing this ballad, and we can assume hundreds of unrecorded performances in this time period of My Funny Valentine. Pause the video right here and take a quick sample of the 1956 version on Cookin', and then check out the 1964 version from Philharmonic Hall. Notice how Miles's approach had evolved in 8 years, from a fairly direct stating of a romantic ballad to a piece of music that's far deeper and darker in a way. Just a word about context. We can't overlook the fact that the world, and the U.S. in particular, had gone through dramatic changes in the 8 years from 1956 to 1964. In 1963 alone, there was a March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, the bombing of a Birmingham church that killed 4 African-American girls, the assassination of Medgar Evers and JFK. On top of that, the event at Philharmonic Hall was a fundraiser for voter registration in Mississippi and Louisiana, and the band was informed by Miles just moments before going on that they were playing for free. If you have listened to the complete recordings, you would agree there's a good bit of tension on stage that night. Context is everything. Toolbox suggestion number 1. If you have pieces in your repertoire that you play consistently, allow your approach to evolve with each performance. Don't force it, allow it to evolve, while always considering the context. For example, if the bride requests My Funny Valentine for the first dance, think twice before opting for the Miles 1964 approach. Let's take a moment to determine where we are in our development as jazz improvisers. Now, I'm going to go fast because we have a lot more stuff to talk about. But first, just a few moments for some review. I searched in my teaching for what might be called a unified theory to define the process of improvisation, something that would hold up in all situations for beginners and advanced improvisers. Here's the basic formula. A musical memory with some musical imagination equals musical improvisation. There are 3 kinds of musical memories: intellectual, what we think in our mind's eye; oral, what we hear in our mind's ear; and kinesthetic, what we feel in our body. Performing an improvised solo is one of 3 activities: quoting melodies, reinventing melodies, ornamenting melodies. Quoting is not really improvising, but helpful. So the 2 basic skills remain: reinvention and ornamentation. Trees make a good analogy. 3 trees: the original, the ornamented tree, and the reinvented tree. The reinvented tree has nothing added. The ornamented tree has things added. Relating that idea to a melody would look like this. For a more in-depth discussion with examples, check out pages 16 and 17 of E.E. Jazz Book 2. So where are we? Maybe we've done step 1. We know a lot of melodies. Our head is full of trees, so to speak. And maybe we can reinvent and ornament those trees with some success. But now we want to get fancy. We want fancier trees. We turn to transcriptions. By the way, check out Dave Liebman's Improviser's Guide to Transcriptions. So we commit a transcription to memory, then we dissect it, break it up, maybe learn our favorite parts in 12 keys. By the way, I've done a lot of this, and it is helpful. Then we try to make a solo or solos from the parts. We assemble them, and we wonder, why doesn't it sound fresh, personal, or spontaneous? Why does assembling lack something? Because it's not improvising. It hasn't the spontaneity or the organic quality of interesting jazz. Because it's not improvising. What's the fix? To keep it interesting, we must be able to reinvent every bit of our vocabulary, everything that we're assembling. And if our tree, that is a transcription, is fairly ornamented already, then reinvention is perhaps the best choice to personalize all those parts that we are assembling. Hey, it's a new year. Let's make a resolution to quit assembling so much. You know, it's interesting. Often the best path to an organic and personal expression is to go back to where we started, when we mainly used our intuition. Toolbox suggestion number 2. Let's tune up our reinvention engine. Exercise 1. Take a short phrase from your favorite tune or transcription and reinvent it for 5 minutes. Try to play something different each time. Here's a short video of me doing exercise 1. You can watch it, or better yet, pause this video and try it yourself. Put a timer on. Go 5 minutes. Exercise 2. Take a short 2-bar phrase from your favorite tune or transcription and play the first bar verbatim, but play something completely different in the second bar. Exercise 2A. Same as number 2, but play something new in the first bar that leads logically into the second bar, which will be a verbatim quote. Here are 2 short videos of me doing 2 and 2A using the first phrase of Charlie Parker's KoKo solo. Remember, expect mistakes. Learning proceeds from sifting out what works from what doesn't work. Discard what doesn't work. Lyle Mayes spoke of motivic manipulation or motivic transformation. In my view, these are just other words for reinvention and ornamentation. If we can apply motivic manipulation, reinvention, and ornamentation to every bit of our vocabulary, jazz standards, pop tunes, or transcription, we increase the odds that our solos will sound fresh, organic, and personal. In the lecture, Lyle stated, "No motivic manipulation or transformation, no creation." I'd like to beg your indulgence to add a personal note right here. During COVID, I began writing fiction. My third novel, Saving Charlie Parker, a time travel jazz history novel. In that book, set in 2020, my main character, a trumpeter, spends 4 months playing every bar of the omnibook in 12 keys. I did the same thing at that time, and here's what I learned. Charlie Parker's vocabulary is surprisingly repetitive, but his solos always sound fresh. This is because he is a master at reinvention and ornamentation. The repetition is disguised through motivic manipulation. That's Lyle's term. Now, there are 7 ways to reinvent a melody: syncopation, iteration, displacement, augmentation, diminution, repetition, and truncation. The most powerful of these and the most difficult to master is displacement. Bird mastered it. He didn't just play his music, he played with his music. For example, Bird recorded Cherokee at least 3 times, maybe 4, and there's probably live recordings somewhere. But in the 3 famous ones, the ones from 41, 43, and 45, he plays the same vocabulary on the bridge section. You know, that's the hard part that's in 4 different keys. He borrows material from 2 tunes that were popular at the time, T for Two, and a background figure from a Raymond Scott big band tune that was popular at the time. Although these are quotes, they are highly disguised through the use of reinvention, in particular displacement. Here he uses the T for Two lick in a highly ornamented fashion in 1943, fairly much straight up and down with the meter, and then in 45 you see him displacing it, making it different, new and fresh. The previous example showed displacement by the quarter note, but even more disguising is the use of displacement at the 8th note. Notice how these 2 melodies, exactly the same notes as they begin, sound completely different when they're displaced 1/8 note. Here's the principle at work. Meter and harmony are wedded, they're connected. The ear gives harmonic weight to pitches which land on the downbeats 1, 2, 3, and 4. Displacement at the 8th note plays against that. Another way of saying it is that displacement contributes to the dance of the music. Question: are your solos dancing or marching? Toolbox suggestion: take your vocabulary, your most favorite licks, practice them starting an 8th early or an 8th note late. It's more difficult than you might think. One word of caution: be careful around the bar lines, particularly when the chord changes. Hal Crook in his book says that at the point of chord change, if it happens over the bar, that the melody should be either connected by steps or should move from chord tone to chord tone. Anything other than that will draw attention to the melody and make it sound awkward. Lyle Mayes encouraged students to be adventurous melodically, have a willingness to leave home. Every great adventure involves some danger and wrong turns. The more adventurous you can be with your toolbox exercise 2 and 2A, the more your solos have a better chance of being interesting. Time for a seemingly rash statement. The main goal of the improviser is to gain or command and maintain the interest of the listener. Now wait. Don't jump all over me. Remember, context is everything, and my wording is specific. I did not say attention, and I did not say demand. Much music in today's culture demands our attention and relies on extratonal elements, lyrics, movement, dancing, costumes, instrumentation, textural variety, and sheer volume. Remember, even a car wreck demands our attention. In the context of a reasonably well-informed jazz audience, what makes some jazz improvisation interesting and some not? For our answer, we borrow from Jerry Coker's Improvising Jazz. I will take the liberty to paraphrase a bit here. What Coker states that he and David Cannonball, who was the founder of the Journal of Music Theory, postulated that for an informed listener to remain interested in a piece of music, they must predict what's going to happen and be right half the time and wrong half the time. If a solo is too predictable, it's boring. If it's too unpredictable, it's confusing. Consider this. Try to surprise yourself when you improvise. So what are those things that can interfere with our ability to maintain the listener's interest? I would say lack of flow is the big one. Flow requires that our musical ideas are connected. My friend and former colleague Jim Riggs, in his Styles and Analysis class at the University of North Texas, identified a common feature of great solos. He called it conversational connection. The principle is this. Commonly, jazz phrases are connected one to another by linking the last note or notes of a phrase to the first note or notes of a subsequent phrase, most often with the same pitch, pitches a step apart, or at times groups of pitches. Pause the video right here, and using the link below, listen to Charlie Parker's KoKo solo. In the transcription, notice how often Bird connects the last note or notes of one phrase to the next note or notes of the next phrase. These connections give the solo a sense of flow and make it logical and clear to the listener, more memorable. Toolbox suggestion number 3. Let's tune up our flow with conversational connections. Use a simple progression. Start each new phrase from the last note of the preceding. Here's a short video of me doing Toolbox suggestion number 3 using a simple blues progression. Remember, jazz is a conversation between members of the ensemble, but also between the phrases within a solo. The connections maintain flow and, in return, the listener's interest in the story. The principle has a direct correlation to other disciplines, such as prose. Here's an excerpt from my 4th novel, Murder at Birdland. There was something strange about Vincent's face that Martin found disturbing. It was a mean face, sad and mean, as if its default setting was some combination of sorrow, anger, and disappointment. I believe the next sentence starts with the word disappointment. A brief comment here about something that has informed my musicianship. Dave Liebman, in his UNT residency in 1998, did an extensive presentation about the importance of transcribing. At the end of it, he said something very interesting, and it has stuck with me for a long time. He said, ultimately, your inspiration for the musical direction you take will probably come from some other music than jazz, or some art form other than music, visual arts, literature, and dance. I know for a fact personally that my fiction writing has informed my jazz soloing. I would encourage you to look beyond jazz music and music in general to find things that might inspire your creation of music, whether it's composition or soloing. Another principle at work that improves flow and maintains interest is step progression, outlined by Paul Hindemith in The Craft of Composition. Page 187, the real building units of melody are seconds. Page 193. The primary law of melodic construction is that a smooth and convincing melodic outline is achieved only when important notes form a progression of seconds. Most well-constructed standard songs utilize this principle. In some, like Autumn Leaves, it is obvious. The first moves down by step every 2 bars. The second starts at the bridge and moves upward every 2 bars. The final step progression begins on the song's starting note and moves down by step to the tonic tone. Effective soloists like Miles Davis exploit this principle of step progression in their solos, at times by exploiting the given step progression in the melody, and at other times constructing a new step progression of their own. You may want to pause the video right here and use the link to find this Miles Davis solo as you follow along with the transcription. Miles begins his solo on the ninth of the chord rather than the third of the chord, but then proceeds to use the original step progression of the song. At the end of that 8 bars, instead of going to the third of the tonic chord, he ends on the sixth of the chord. In the second 8, instead of hitting the third of the chord, he goes on the other side of it and hits the 11th. He still adheres to the original step progression, then reminds the listener of that sixth of the tonic chord before going to the root. Instead of beginning the bridge on the melody note, which is the root of the chord, he starts on the 11th. But then he ends up where the original melody does, on the tonic of the 1 chord. He begins the last 8 bars retracing the original step progression of the song, but surprises the listener with the 9th of the 1 chord instead of the tonic. Do you remember the prediction versus surprise concept from KoKo? The notes Miles chooses are not only surprising, but they're also ambiguous. At 32 minutes into his lecture, Lyle begins to talk about the importance of ambiguity. I will admit it is not something I had really considered before, but as he spoke of it, I could recognize it in his own music, and I could see a lack of it in mine. He clarifies that ambiguity is not obscurity, hiding something. Ambiguity is having the quality of being understood in multiple ways. Most great art has the quality of ambiguity. Unfortunately, much of what we consume in the media, TV, movies, some fiction, lacks this quality. Characters are one-dimensional, good guys versus bad guys. Situations are happy or sad. Consider the smile of the Mona Lisa. Consider the blues. Is it happy or sad? The great poet Robert Frost was once asked to explain the meaning of a poem. He replied, "Do you want me to say it again, only worse?" Consider a great poet who is still among us, Bob Dylan. Pause the video and use the link to listen to A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall by Bob Dylan, one of his earliest recordings. You might be wondering why I would use Bob Dylan as an example in a jazz presentation. Well, much of Bob Dylan's music offers a great model of art which is ambiguous and full of surprise. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall is a perfect example. The images are vivid and we recognize them, but the actual meaning of the lyrics is unclear to us. We can visualize misty mountains and sad forests, but then there's a graveyard with a mouth. Notice how the first verse of the song has both unity via the meter and the alliteration, and ambiguity. The character has stumbled, he's walked, he's crawled, he's stepped, he's been out in front of, and he's been 10,000 miles. And there's the enumeration, 12 misty mountains, 6 crooked highways, 7 sad forests, a dozen dead oceans, and 10,000 miles in the mouth of a graveyard. The mouth of a graveyard is extremely ambiguous. It could mean 1,000 different things. It's both chilling and interesting at the same time. The music of both Miles Davis and Bob Dylan share ambiguity, surprise, and a sense of adventure. Lyle Mayes suggested that our solos should have a sense of adventure. He stated that the listener wants to be taken on a journey. To have a sense of journey, we must be willing to leave home. My interpretation is that home is often the usual way we might approach a solo, perhaps our first pet phrase. One of the most adventurous musicians I have known personally is Tim Higgins, who once mentioned that he purposely will often start a solo by playing on changes of a different tune, immediately painting himself into a corner from which he must escape. There are direct parallels in other disciplines such as film. For example, North by Northwest, The Fugitive, Shawshank Redemption, Minority Report. In each of those, we don't really know what's going on when it starts. It's ambiguous. Before we know it, we are on a journey. How can we be adventurous when the choices are a tangle of endless possibilities? To answer that, we return to Stravinsky. In his Poetics, he states that he often begins a piece by deciding what he is not going to do. He states, the more art is controlled, limited, worked over, the more it is free. Toolbox item number 4. Exercise your adventurousness. Make a conscious effort to limit something in your next solo or composition. Take one or more things out of your tangle of endless possibilities. Grammaticism, modal approach, 2/5 licks, major sevenths, no large intervals, no correct notes. You decide and stick with it. Toolbox item number 4A. Exercise your adventurousness. Start your next solo with a distinctly adventurous motif. Exploit it using motivic transformation. Maintaining interest. Some things to think about. Repetition. Repetition is powerful. It can sustain interest. But if used inartfully or unartfully, it can allow the listener permission to tune out. Think of background music on TV. It is important to understand the why of repetition, why it works, and why it doesn't. Repetitive motifs draw attention to the moment and slow things down. If the motif is interesting, it may deserve to be observed more slowly. If the melody is repetitive but the underlying harmony is changing, interest can be maintained. We often lose the listener's interest through inadvertent repetition. Some of us will repeat certain phrases in particular areas of songs, such as the bridge to Cherokee. I know this because I'm guilty of it. Toolbox item number 5. Identify your inadvertent repetition. Find a recent recording of yourself, one where you play an extended solo. Listen for the places where you repeat yourself. 2 solutions. Isolate the areas where you tend to repeat and shed them more carefully. Acquire more vocabulary. Or 2, play shorter solos. Losing the listener's interest through inadvertent repetition of certain notes. Often within a group of phrases, we will return to a particular note too many times. This is particularly detrimental if the note is at the top or bottom of our phrase. We build a ceiling and a floor, so to speak. Toolbox item number 6, moving the ceiling. Improvise on a comfortable progression, moving the highest note of each subsequent phrase up in steps. Here's a short video of me playing on a blues, and each 2-bar phrase emphasizes a note 1 step higher than the one before it. Toolbox item 6A, controlling tessitura. This is similar to the last exercise, but limit your soloing to particular pitch ranges. I'd now like to turn our attention to a very important topic, what I'd call finding your voice. Lyle Mayes, in his opening sentence of his first Q&A in his 2010 Gomez residency at our school, University of North Texas, he said this: "I think the idea of finding one's voice is a fool's errand." The topic was discussed in his 1993 lecture as well. That year he spoke of having a style, a unique and personal style. He spoke at some length about style in the context of the postmodern world in music, suggesting that there was no next thing in music. Therefore, if there's no definitive current style, we have a potential for all styles to be at our disposal. I thought that was a fascinating and encouraging insight. He spoke of his own experience as a student as he tried to have a style by at times playing things wrong. At some point he gave up. He thought he wouldn't have a unique style or voice. Then he said after a few years, people began complimenting him on his unique style. He encouraged students by saying that if you study something long enough, your own style or voice will emerge. This was a very hopeful message for our students, and for me. His advice was that students attempt to step outside of themselves and listen to their music, their solos and their compositions, as if they were a non-musician, as if they knew nothing about music. Attempt to identify what sticks out, what works, what has clarity, unity, and flow. Now, this idea of finding a voice is a hot topic, and there's some divergence of opinion. For example, Dave Liebman outlines a step-by-step system of finding our voice in his article, Finding Oneself, The Road to Self-Discovery. He has 10 steps. Number 1, admit the possibility. 2, be clinical, objective. 3, strip away obvious influences. 4, transcribe yourself. Identify what is unique. 5, write exercises and compositions on that uniqueness. 6, finds what is missing. Is it balance, tension, release? 7, avoid the instrumental trap. Don't play what your fingers lead you to. 8, look outward to other genres like poetry or film or visual arts. 9, don't fear being different. And 10, embrace the work. It's difficult. This is a hard task. I think there's a certain amount of overlap in these two approaches. Lyle stated that if we refine the skills, in particular of motivic transformation, we can't help but have a voice. He adds that sounding imitative is not an indication that you've listened too much, but rather that you haven't listened enough. You may have identified the what, but you haven't discerned the why. Before we close, I want to thank Jen for letting me do this presentation, and Hal Leonard and Yamaha for making it possible for me to be at the conference, and you for finding this on YouTube to watch it. I've decided to end this presentation with a short excerpt of the way Lyle ended his lecture. He sat down at the piano and said, I'm going to play some things that will demonstrate what I've been talking about. He said, I'm going to use one of my favorite tunes, Stella by Starlight. So here is Lyle performing Stella by Starlight in 1993.